Tia ei siellä ärtää. Tiassi jirsait. Ja don sich de baibere ti.
History is generally very bleak. Things haven't been particularly easy for people throughout our existence, and we've learned a great deal in that time. Someone might not be safe to be in close proximity to, so it's best to be prepared and be cautious of strangers. Someone we know might not respect us as much as we respect them, so it is important to be aware of who's around you and what they might be trying to achieve. Having people around is beneficial, but when does it reach that stage where there are too many? And while we might have all of these social anxieties, there are still things hidden in the darkness. Shapes we mightn't fully recognize that could strike out at any moment and drag us into the abyss. These things are as much concerns nowadays as they have been for the past couple of thousand years, and with their longevity comes traditional means to understand and deal with the world. Mundaun is a modernization of some of these traditions. Set in a tiny mountaintop village sometime in the early 20th century, Mundaun is a Swiss survival horror game in which the player's grandfather had accepted a rather unsavory deal many years in the past. The dealer hadn't been sufficiently compensated for their services and has finally returned to collect what is owed. The player's grandfather dies shortly afterward, and the local priest sends a letter to the man's next of kin to make them aware of the death. Not to be left in the dark about the mysterious circumstances, Kurdin travels to the village to investigate. Upon arriving, Kurdin finds his grandfather's body seared into the charred remains of a barn, which doesn't align with the details of the priest's letter. So naturally, the next stop is the chapel. The father isn't too pleased to see Kurdin, and had hoped that the letter was a significant enough warning to keep away. He hands Kurdin a ceremonial candle and ushers him to stay safe inside Kurdin's grandfather's old home. As night falls, humanoid creatures begin to emerge from the hay being dried throughout the village. His grandfather's house is filled with memories, as well as a number of doors that Kurdin is unable to access. In order to find more information, and perhaps a means to lift the curse laid upon his grandfather, Kurdin will have to interrogate the locals. This leads him further and further up the mountain, encountering a handful of other bizarre beings, and learning about the events of the day of the original deal. Eventually, Kurdin reaches the top of the mountain and must enter it in order to find resolution. Clearly, the most striking aspect of Mundaun is the visual presentation. The entire game is drawn by hand, using sketching pencils to provide all of the textures, particles, user interface pieces, and clues for discovering the secrets of the mountain. This means that the game is entirely grey, and yet its visuals are so gorgeous and filled with depth that this limitation becomes almost unnoticeable. The skyboxes in particular are incredible. Within this gameplay style, the limited palette is far less invasive than it was in Otherside or The Eternal Castle, which results in far more readable artistic direction. The architecture of the buildings is recognizably Swiss, despite lacking the browns and greens commonly associated with the region's architecture. The character models are mostly great. The problems that I found with them were almost entirely animation-based. The pencil textures were consistently good. There is a tendency to keep the characters from being animated in any way. Rather, they transition between poses, and their mouths flap open and closed. This extends to the enemies, who often don't do much in the way of attacking. Instead, they'll raise whatever appendage causes the damage function to occur, and that's their attack. An unfortunate misstep in the visuals. The audio portion is exemplary, however. The game often lingers in ambience, letting the soundscape do a lot of the work in developing the tension. horror media is rarely successful on the scariness of the monsters within. Instead, the skill lies in building an atmosphere that lulls the viewer into a deep unease, which can then be exploited for scares. The non-diegetic music consists almost entirely of droning sounds, and only appears whenever an enemy is nearby. There is a lot of music to be heard within Mundaun, but without a radio to receive the music, the total number of tracks is very low. Radios are present at various locations throughout the game, and the player is able to change stations, this function almost only existing for music listening.
Allù es urs del fla il bunker visitava altre. Kilohertz, ne frequenze de radio.
Because of the frequent quietness and the generally dark atmosphere, Mundaun's tension is built rather naturally and impressively. The player will often be required to enter areas with clear danger, but the game never forces the player into a dangerous situation. This means that the player is in the driving seat for almost the entire time, which might be welcome to those with a lower tolerance for horror, but it does leave everyone else behind. If the most frightening thing about a horror film was that the protagonist walked through a dark hallway for a while, then I'm not sure that film would have really succeeded in its intention. Mundaun has monsters, it has dark places, there are suspicious people floating around the village, and things within the familiar environments change over time. But that claustrophobic hallway is the only part of this game that made me feel uncomfortable. The monsters aren't particularly dangerous, and the player is given a means to deal with them far in advance of their appearances. The models aren't especially unsettling either. All of the dark places within Mundaun are free of danger. All of them. In fact, a dark place is usually the best location to find items to scavenge. None of the other characters are dangerous to the player, and the things that do change within environments are mostly just surface level and barely go further than noticing something that wasn't there before. The anticipation is excellent. It just never goes anywhere. Mundaun also falls into some common tropes that many other indie horror games do. It contains baffling features like a sanity mechanic, but it also gives the player weapons to attack the creatures they can't look at. When Amnesia did this in 2010, it was a pretty novel idea, but there have been 11 years of copycats in that time. Moreover, there wasn't the strange design conflict within Amnesia, since the player is never able to combat the enemies. This system can be mitigated within Mundaun by drinking coffee, which is actually one of my favourite parts about the game. While the mechanical aspect of being less afraid of enemies is poor, the process of coffee making in the early 20th century style is quite rewarding itself. Khurdin can't simply consume coffee grounds from the can. He must collect water in a pan, find a stove, mix the coffee grounds into the water, find firewood and a match, boil the coffee, and then find a cup to drink the coffee from. There are only a handful of coffee cans to find throughout the game, so it never becomes tedious. The game is also filled with other sequences of actions that could probably be classified as puzzles. Instructions in a notebook aren't clues to a puzzle, they're just the solution. This isn't a problem that's exclusive to Mundaun, but it is a criticism that applies. The objective of Mundaun is to reach the top of the mountain and enter a cave. There are a few barriers preventing Khurdin from simply driving to the top, so the player will have to engage with the smaller quest lines within each area in order to gain access. A lesser game would simply make these barriers doors and hide keys within the area, but Mundaun has made the keys and locks much more complex. In order to progress to the final region, for example, The player must use a mounted turret to clear snow from a heavily blocked tunnel entrance. However, earning the ability to use these tools consists mainly of fetch quests. Can't earn permission to use the big gun if you don't give the little girl honey. Buried guy won't tell you the password if you don't feed him schnapps. Enemies are dealt with most effectively by avoiding them. They generally use ranged attacks to damage the player, so the player should do their best to stay out of the enemy's line of sight. It is possible to kill some enemies, but the resources to do this are quite limited. During the early portions of the game, the only weapon the player will have access to are wooden hay forks. These are logically quite effective against the hay creatures, but killing one of these creatures uses the entire durability of a fork. If there are ever multiple enemies to combat, it is unlikely that the player will actually be capable of killing more than one. Later on, the beekeepers aren't really battled as much as their attacks are dissolved and the enemy itself avoided. Since they release a swarm of bees as their attack, the player must use a pipe to blow smoke that sends the bees into orbit. This pacifies the attack, but the beekeeper is still alive. Around this time, the player is given a rifle that could be used for killing the beekeepers, but there isn't much of a reason to. The Yeti enemy is unkillable, and the soldiers are far too plentiful for the player to really attempt to kill them. It is more likely that a second or third soldier will join the battle, and the player won't survive that encounter. The enemies themselves are interesting concepts, but their mechanical designs are very underwhelming. The hay creatures look a lot like the haystacks scattered around the village, and when they're standing still can be difficult to distinguish from one. This is an effective use of the setting to generate a thematic enemy, but their attacks just put hay in Khurdin's eyes while they point at him. They look spooky, and are effectively camouflaged, but they're ultimately not that threatening. The beekeepers are similarly spooky looking, but the counter to their attacks ultimately removes any degree of threat they might have held. The Yeti is actually a Tschäggättä creature, a folktale monster that is embodied by the people of the Tschäggättä Valley during a yearly carnival. Within Mundaun, the creature is much heavier than a human, and seems to be able to cast spells. It is far too slow to be dangerous though. The soldiers appear within the final few minutes of the game, and the objective is to escape the area the soldiers occupy. This isn't particularly difficult, and can be done in around 6 minutes if the player is being cautious. These enemies are in the game for about 1% of the total runtime, and aren't as conceptually engaging as the other enemies. That final portion of the game is where the better aspects of Mundaun melt away, and things feel awfully rushed. After Khurdin is limply captured within the cave at the peak of the mountain, he has a vision in which the stranger that was behind the events captures a girl from the village. This immediately inspires Khurdin to speed down the mountain to the chapel from the start of the game. The soldiers are briefly present before the player drives the truck the rest of the way down. Inside the chapel, the stranger is no longer in a human shape, and appears to be trying to eat the girl. Shining a lantern on him makes the stranger withdraw into the ceiling, and I was able to reach her. Once outside, Khurdin passes out and goes back to the moment the original deal was signed. Khurdin convinces his grandfather not to take the deal, undoing all of the damage that occurred within the week or so of Khurdin's arrival in Mundaun. Khurdin awakens to the funeral of his grandfather finally being able to proceed. But since he had time traveled and altered the past, Khurdin's grandfather now has died in his sleep instead of being burned in the barn. Time travel is how this story concludes. Mundaun is a game that shows a lot of promise. A lot of investment went into making the game look excellent and implementing the traditional mediums within the design. This investment absolutely paid off, and I doubt many would contest that success. But the gameplay here is critically shallow, and the narrative isn't especially satisfying. Features have been included, but haven't been totally considered, and while there are many supernatural elements already within the story, it seems odd that the writing reached a point of desperation for resolution. Did history really need to be rewritten to defeat this evil? Does tradition not contain a better example for what to do if one were to take a deal with the devil? Is just don't the original advice Hidden Fields had intended to deliver? Next time, I'm making movies.